In the brutal winter of 1873, deep within a remote settlement in the Dakota Territory, a young pioneer family sat down to dinner inside their timber cabin. The wind was howling outside at 20 degrees below zero. On the wooden table sat a heavy loaf of freshly baked white bread, golden and warm from the iron stove. The father sliced the loaf, sharing it among his wife and 3 children. They ate hungrily, believing that as long as they had flour in the barrel and bread on the table, their family was completely safe from the wilderness cold. By the early weeks of spring, when the snow finally began to melt off the pine branches, every single member of that family was bedridden, suffering from severe skin lesions, mental confusion, violent digestive failure, and extreme paralysis. Their bodies were wasting away despite having ate full meals of flour every single day. When the local trail doctor finally reached the cabin, the rumor in the settlement was simple and familiar. People said the harsh blizzard winter had taken them, or that some mysterious mountain fever had swept through the cabin. People always preferred a wild story. It sounded dramatic. It sounded unpreventable. But the historical medical ledgers tell a far darker biological truth. Not a single person in that cabin died of cold, fever, or infectious disease. The killer was a myth, a deeply entrenched piece of 19th century.
Listen closely, children, to the time before the great snows came and changed the world. Sit close to the fire, child, and listen. The wind outside howls the same songs our ancestors heard. These lines on my face, they are not from sadness. They are the map of my journey, etched by the sun and the wind. The old ways teach us that every ending is also a beginning. We carry the spirits of our ancestors in our breath. Sit close to the fire and listen. The old stories have lessons for the young ones. My grandfather used to say that the land remembers everything, even when the people forget.
Today, we must look at how human beings preserved grain for thousands of years before the rise of industrial commercial milling. What those pioneer families were attempting to do relied on an ancient biochemical relationship between whole grain, wild microorganisms, and human digestive systems. For over 3,000 years, traditional Amish families and pioneer ancestors never consumed refined flour the way modern society does. When your great-great-grandmother made bread, she didn't buy bleached white flour in a paper bag from a supermarket shelf, nor did she use quick-rising commercial yeast packages loaded with chemical conditioners. She practiced the ancient art of slow sourdough sponge fermentation. She took fresh whole wheat or rye, crushed it between stone wheels, mixed it with pure spring water, and allowed wild lactobacilli bacteria and wild yeasts present in the air to slowly ferment the dough over 18 to 24 hours. That slow fermentation was not just about getting bread to rise, it was a mandatory biological safety process. Raw wheat and rye grains contain high levels of phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that binds tightly to essential minerals like iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium inside the human gut, preventing your body from absorbing them. Raw, unfermented grain also contains complex gluten proteins that are virtually indigestible to human stomach acid without microbial predigestion. During a slow 24-hour wild sourdough fermentation, lactobacilli bacteria produce lactic acid, dropping the pH of the dough and activating an enzyme called phytase. Phytase completely breaks down phytic acid, unlocking vital minerals and predigesting gluten proteins into simple amino acids. Furthermore, the lactic acid lowers the moisture activity, creating a natural preservative shield that kept traditional sourdough bread fresh and mold-free in a Pioneer saddlebag for over 3 weeks without a single chemical preservative. Then came the Industrial Revolution of the 1870s, and with it, the invention of the high-speed roller mill. The food industry realized that whole wheat flour containing the natural wheat germ and bran went rancid within weeks on store shelves because of natural oils. To solve their distribution problem and maximize corporate profits, the roller mills stripped away the nutrient-rich germ and fibrous bran, leaving behind pure, dead white starch. They bleached it with chemicals to make it look clean, packed it into barrels and marketed it to frontier families as modern progress. What the commercial millers gained in shelf life, pioneer families lost in human life. By stripping the germ and eliminating slow wild fermentation, they created a food that looked like flour, tasted like bread, but was completely devoid of niacin, vitamin B3, thiamine, and essential bioavailable minerals. When pioneer families trapped in snowbound cabins lived through long winters on diets consisting primarily of white flour biscuits, salt pork, and coffee, their bodies rapidly depleted their internal stores of niacin and thiamine. Within 60 days, they contracted severe pellagra and beriberi. Pellagra was known historically as the disease of the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. The skin on their hands and faces turned dark and scaly. Their digestive tracts inflamed so severely they could no longer absorb water, and their nervous systems collapsed into profound hallucinations and delirium. They were starving to death with bellies full of hot white biscuits. Adding to this tragedy was the silent threat of grain mold and ergot poisoning. When whole grains were stored in damp wooden barrels near cabin walls, moisture often seeped inside, creating ideal conditions for claviceps purpurea, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye and wheat. Ergot produces powerful alkaloid toxins that constrict blood vessels violently, causing gangrene in fingers and toes, severe muscle spasms, and terrifying mental convulsions. Pioneer families who baked bread from damp, improperly aged flour were unwittingly poisoning their own children at the dinner table. Traditional Amish homesteaders and master pioneer bakers never fell into this trap because they followed a strict, zero-tolerance set of grain management rules that protected their families from both nutrient starvation and fungal toxicity. Rule 1 was the stone and sprout test. An experienced pioneer never stored ground flour for long periods. She stored whole, uncracked grain kernels in tight, dry white oak barrels raised off the damp floor on stone blocks. Whole, uncracked grain kernels carry a natural protective outer husk that protects the interior from oxygen and mold for decades. Before milling a batch of grain, she conducted a simple viability test. She took a handful of wheat berries, placed them in a damp cloth near the hearth for 48 hours. If 80% of the seeds sprouted fresh green shoots, the grain was alive, rich in active enzymes, and completely free of toxic molds. If the seeds failed to sprout or smelled of sour dampness, the entire barrel was rejected and discarded. Rule 2 was the long sponge fermentation. The old-timers never rushed bread with fast-acting yeasts. They kept a continuous sourdough starter culture known as the mother sponge, alive in a stoneware crock in a cool corner of the kitchen. This sponge contained a stable symbiotic colony of wild yeasts and beneficial lactic acid bacteria that had been passed down through generations. Every loaf of bread required a 2-stage fermentation process. First, the whole stone-ground flour was mixed with water and starter culture to create a thick sponge, which sat overnight near the warm stove for 12 to 16 hours. This long soak allowed the phytase enzymes to neutralize every molecule of phytic acid and unlock the B-complex vitamins trapped inside the grain germ. Only then was additional flour and salt kneaded into the dough for a second rise before baking. Rule 3 was the acidic crust seal. Traditional pioneer bread was baked in heavy preheated cast-iron Dutch ovens placed directly into glowing wood embers. The high radiant heat created a thick, dark caramelized outer crust that sealed the interior crumb from atmospheric humidity. The natural lactic acid produced during fermentation, combined with a thick baked crust, created an environment where mold spores could not take root. A loaf of traditional stone-ground sourdough could sit on a homestead shelf for a month without spoiling, while modern commercial white bread turns to green mold within 5 days. The commercial food industry did not eliminate these ancient grain practices because they found a healthier way to feed humanity. They eliminated them because slow 24-hour sourdough fermentation cannot be easily mass-produced in factory assembly lines, and whole stone-ground flour cannot sit on supermarket shelves for 2 years without spoiling. They solved a corporate shipping problem and then spent 70 years convincing modern society that traditional sourdough was just an artisanal hobby rather than a mandatory biological survival skill. Think about what has happened to modern health over the last 50 years. Millions of people suffer from chronic digestive inflammation, gluten sensitivity, autoimmune flare-ups, and metabolic disease. We are told that wheat itself is the enemy. But our ancestors ate whole wheat for thousands of years without chronic digestive collapse. The enemy was never the wheat. The enemy was what the modern industrial process did to the wheat, stripping away the germ, bleaching away the nutrients, and skipping the vital 24-hour microbial fermentation that makes grain safe for human digestion. This video was never just about flour, sourdough starters, or 19th century pioneer cabins, my friend. It is about a far deeper human issue, reclaiming your nutritional sovereignty. Over the last several decades, we have quietly surrendered our basic human competence to industrial food conglomerates. We buy pre-sliced, chemical-laden bread in plastic bags under fluorescent grocery lights, completely oblivious to how real bread is made, how grain is preserved, or how to nourish our families if the distribution trucks ever stop running. If a severe emergency or economic crisis disrupts the food supply chain for 2 weeks, supermarket shelves will be cleared of commercial bread in hours. Most households have no whole grain stored, no stone hand mill, no live sourdough culture, and zero knowledge of how to turn basic raw grain into a life-saving, nutrient-dense loaf of bread. Learning the old ways is not about fear or survivalist paranoia. It is about becoming a resilient person who cannot be easily shut off. If the power grid fails, your family eats. If food prices skyrocket, you walk to your pantry, take a cup of live sourdough starter, mix it with simple stone-ground flour, and bake a nourishing meal that has sustained human life for 3,000 years. You do not need to build a stone mill or buy a farm this weekend to start taking back your independence. Start with one simple step. Obtain a real wild sourdough starter culture from a local baker or homestead friend, or cultivate your own using nothing more than organic whole wheat flour and unchlorinated water over 7 days. Learn how to bake a traditional long fermentation loaf in a cast iron Dutch oven. Master the simple habit of allowing wild microbes to pre-digest your grain before it ever touches your table. Experience the difference in how your body feels when you nourish it with real, living, bioavailable bread instead of dead corporate starch. That is your entry ticket. That is taking back the ordinary competence in health that kept your great-great-grandparents alive through the harshest winters in human history. Tell me in the comments below.
Sit now by the fire. I have a story my grandfather told me many seasons ago. We must listen to the earth, children. It holds the memories of our ancestors.